Can you hear me okay? Great. Um, Thank you all for joining us here tonight. I'm going to take a minute to introduce myself, and then I'll allow Damian DiGiulian to introduce himself. And then we've got a presentation to go through for you all tonight, talking about the prep and boarding school admission process. So my name's Brad Diarco. I started Diarco and Associates about 5 years ago now with the goal of helping student athletes and their parents better understand the prep and boarding school admission process, and also really helping to create opportunities for those students and families to help find the right fits for them academically, socially, and athletically. My background is I was a boarding school graduate. I then went on and played Division I college hockey. And following that, I pretty quickly got into working in secondary schools and independent schools. I worked at Brunswick School. Then I worked at Berkshire School for about a decade. I was the director of admission at another school in New Hampshire for a while, and then became the director of admission at Northwood School, a position I held until 2021. In addition to that, during my time at Berkshire, I also coached the boys varsity hockey team, boys varsity soccer team, and girls varsity soccer team. So my background and where I am helpful to families is helping them understand that this process, the prep and boarding school process, is a unique one, and really understanding it from both the admissions and the athletic side is going to be, critically important in order to create opportunities for your children. So I'll allow Damian DiGiulian to introduce himself as well.
Brad said, my name is Damian DiGiulian. I'm a recently retired men's ice hockey coach at the collegiate level. I spent the last 28 years coaching college hockey at Division I level at University of Vermont, Division III at Middlebury, and then most recently the head coach at St. Michael's College up here in Vermont. I was excited to team up with Brad because I've been through this process twice with my own two children. I had one child graduate recently from Kent School, who's now playing Division I hockey. And I have a second child who's currently at Berkshire boarding school, who's trying to play field hockey in college. But, the process was a real eye-opener to me. And since teaming up with Brad, it's become even more of one. And I wish I had this info before getting into it for sure that Brad is about to share with you. So I come at it from an experiential situation with my own children. I also come at it from a kind of what it takes to play both prep school and collegiate athletics. So I'm here to learn, and I'm also here to help in any way that I can.
Great. And so our plan for tonight is I have a presentation with some slides that we'll go through and talk over, and Damien and I will talk as we go through it. At the end of this, we will share this presentation with all of you. Throughout the presentation or at the end of it, if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat, and we'll get into it. We'll do our best to answer as many of them as we can, and we're going to try and keep this sort of an hour or less. So we're going to throw a lot of information at you. At the end of this, you'll have our contact information. My sense is that many of you might leave here with maybe some more questions, and we'd be happy to arrange a time to speak with any of you to talk about your children individually and/or what your situation is. So I'm going to share here and put up my presentation, and then we're going to go from there. Great. So what we're going to talk about tonight is preparing for the prep school admission process, and everything that's involved with that, and sort of for those of you who are thinking about it, maybe where you should start, but also then a little bit about what we do at Diarco and Associates and how we might be able to be helpful to you in this process. So these are some of the things we're going to talk about tonight. A little bit about creating a preliminary list of schools. What are some things you should be focused on in the early stages of the process? The next step, scheduling visits and talking to coaches. a really important one, which I think oftentimes for my hockey families in particular is really helpful, is discussing a little bit about what schools are looking for in applicants and ultimately how they will make an admission decision, and then what our role can be in sort of helping you. Um, so this is a little bit about who we are, and we kind of already went through this part. The one part I left out, which Damian wisely pointed out, is I too am a parent of two current boarding school students. So I put myself through this process very recently. I have a daughter who's a senior at Emma Willard School in Troy, New York, and my son um, is a classmate of Damian's at Berkshire School, where he's a soccer player. Um, Okay, so to start, I think that one of the big questions I get all the time, and particularly I think in the hockey community, is this question of, is now the right time, right? Oftentimes I hear from families like, well, we're thinking about applying to prep schools, but we're not really sure if now is the right time, or maybe we should wait, or we're going to wait to hear from schools, or we're not sure if this is the right option for him, or whether he should stay home and play club, or should we explore junior hockey options. And my advice, or the best piece of advice I can give to all of you, is at least starting with this understanding that engaging in starting the prep school admission process, applying to prep schools, even getting admitted to prep schools, is not making a decision to go to prep school. So going through the process, actively engaging in the process, applying to schools, visiting schools, even getting accepted to schools, the only thing you are doing is creating options for the kids on this call. You're creating options for yourselves. For the parents, it's really about creating options and opportunities for your children. So I think sometimes families feel like, well, in order for me to go through the admission process, we have to make a decision that our son or daughter is ready to go to boarding school. And that's not really the case at all. Making that decision of whether or not they are going to be ready to go to boarding or prep school is further down the road. Really, what the admissions process is about finding the right fits, ultimately if you're accepted to schools, and then ultimately if you have an understanding of what the athletic opportunities might be for you, then you're going to be able to make that decision, and typically that's going to occur in March or April. But you will always have the option to stay home, to explore other hockey opportunities that might be out there. But ultimately, if you don't engage in the process because of the fear that, well, I'm not sure if he's ready, I'm not sure if we're ready to send him away, I don't know if he will be admitted, or I'm not sure what if he gets admitted and the hockey opportunity isn't the right one for him. The reality is, unless you engage in the admissions process, you'll never actually know what those options and opportunities might be. And starting the process, going through it, is not making a decision to go. So for me, I would imagine all of you are on this call because you have some interest in thinking about the prep and boarding school options and opportunities. And my advice to you, whether you work with us and seek our support or not, if you are thinking about this, you should engage in the process. The only thing you're doing is seeking options and opportunities, and ultimately, like at the end of it, you may have some really good ones that you can then choose between those schools, those hockey options, and the ones you may currently have. Um, okay. So this is where, starting to think about the process. I think one of the things that I often hear, or when I'm talking to families, is that the prep and boarding school process often gets conflated with the college process. And people have this misconception that, like, well, if I want to go play prep school athletics, it's going to work like college does. And some coach is going to come into a rink and see my son or daughter play and offer them a spot on their team, and then they're going to get admitted to the school. And the reality of that is, like, that's not how it works at all. I won't say that it's 100% doesn't work like that, but the vast majority of the time, for the vast majority of students, it's not going to work that way. And for a few different reasons. One of them is, unlike college, prep school hockey coaches aren't full-time hockey coaches. They're not full-time. They don't have full-time staffs. And at the end of this, I'll let Damian jump in at the end of this slide, where like unlike college coaches who have the time and flexibility to go out and actively recruit and watch lots of kids and choose them, prep school coaches are math teachers or history teachers, or they're working in the admission office. And so ultimately for them, most of the time, the way they are going to find players that they're interested in is by those students and those families beginning the admissions process, coming to campus, having a chance to meet with them, and then following up. Because of that, advocacy is critical, right? Whether you're your own self advocate or if you're working with us and we're serving as your advocates, making yourself known and aware to schools and to coaches is really important. I think the expectation sometimes is that, well, this is a passive endeavor where because we're playing in all these events, lots of prep school coaches are going to see us. And at some point, someone's going to invite us to come to campus. Like it doesn't work like that a lot of times. And it's not because, your son or daughter isn't a good enough player to play at prep school. It may just be that, like, prep coaches don't have the opportunity to go out and see as many players play as a college coach would. Would you say that's a fair assessment, Damien?
Very fair. And I would also add that if you do see a prep school coach in a rink at one of your events, it's probably because they were told either about your son or daughter or about someone else, and then they go and take the time to watch. They don't have the time to just go from tournament to tournament. Like when you go to all your showcases, you'll see a ton of colleges there. Once they get to within recruiting age, you may see prep school coaches there or a prep school car in the parking lot, but most likely it's because they were told about a particular player, and took the time out to go watch that player. And I can just speak from my experience when my son was applying. He's a pretty accomplished player, but he had to do all his own advocacy. He had to write all his own emails. He had to send all his own video. He had to set up all his own Zoom meetings with the coaches. So they weren't beating down our door. It was more like we were kind of beating down their door, and ended up finding a good place by doing that. So everything Brad said from my experience is incredibly true.
And we'll also talk a little bit about this as we go through. I think one of the other big differences we'll talk about is, and you will hear me say this multiple times tonight, or if you go on our website and you review any of the other webinars we've done in the past, in prep schools, coaches are not making admission decisions. So ultimately, the decision about whether or not your son or daughter is going to be admitted to a school is going to be made by an admissions director, not a coach. A coach may have some impact or may be able to influence that decision, but it's really different. And so for us, when we're working with clients, to Damien's point, oftentimes we are encouraging coaches to go out and see kids play. In order for me to do that, it often comes after a conversation that I've had with the coach where I can assure them, like, look, I know this student's profile. I know what the applicant pool at your school looks like. This is a student that has not only a high likelihood of applying to your school, but also has a relatively high likelihood of being admitted. And so at that point, it really is kind of worth what is their limited time to maybe go out and see a player play, with the understanding that if he is admitted, they want to be able to project to the family where he might fit into their program. Um, so this is another one where I talk about like the difference between colleges and how this works. And I think oftentimes people are surprised by this. And I know when I first started saying this to Damien, when we started working together, he was sort of shocked by it, but ultimately, I think as we talk more about it, realizes it's true. Success is not determined by winning games. And what I mean by that is for the schools, the value of their athletics programs is not in winning championships. It's not, again, it's not like college, right? There's no bonus money, there's no more TV time for making a tournament. There's none of that. So ultimately, what schools think about is there obviously is some really valuable educational experiences students can have by participating in athletics, and that's great. But ultimately, they view their athletics programs as a means to help strengthen their college placement, right? All of these schools are very aware that what will make them attractive is the outcome that their graduates have. And so for them, the athletics programs become a great way to help strengthen their college placement. Because of that, it is the lens through which all of these schools make their admissions decisions. And so what I mean by that is like having been a prep coach, but also being a prep director of admission, like um, a coach walking into my office and saying like, hey, I've seen this kid play. He's great. If we bring him in here, he's going to help us win 5 more games next year and win a New England Prep School championship. My answer to a coach is like, that's great. But if we look at his grades and we look at his talent as a hockey player, ultimately, where do you think he might be able to matriculate in college? Like, is he good enough that hockey might impact his college options? And then ultimately, like, does he have an academic profile in which, he's going to be able to be recruited by a wide range of colleges, right? And this is particularly magnified in hockey. Um, Unlike basketball or soccer, where there's, hundreds and hundreds of Division I programs and hundreds of Division III programs, college hockey, and Damian, you can check my numbers at the Division I level. I think it's about there's 59 or 60 Division I programs, a handful of Division II programs, about 58 or so Division III programs, and many of those schools have really high admission standards, right? Like at the Division I level, you've got ECAC schools. At the Division III level, you've got NESCAC schools. And ultimately, even if you are a really good athlete, you have to meet a pretty high academic bar to be admitted to those schools. And so, for admission offices, when they're talking to coaches, the paradigm through which they're going to decide whether or not this athlete or this hockey player is one that we would like to admit to the school and have here isn't going to be he's going to help us win games. It's going to be he can come here and find success academically, and our coach is telling us that he is talented enough that that might impact his college process. And when we combine those things, this looks like a student that might have a really good and strong range of outcomes. That's the kind of student we want to have in our school. But again, coaches want to win. Coaches want to win desperately, and that part of it is true. But as I said before, they're not the ones making the admission decisions. Their admission office is, and the lens through which they make that decision isn't about the number of games that an applicant can help that team win. It's what type of college options will that student have on the way out. Um, did I miss anything there, Damien?
No, you nailed that one.
Great. I was just checking on my numbers because I think I'm pretty close. Um, okay. So when we think about prep schools, I know you guys are with McFairfield. I'm often surprised, like if I talk to parents from this organization or organizations similar to it, right? And ask them to name prep schools, many of you would say, well, you know a lot of prep schools, and you might be able to name 5, 6, 7, 8 schools that you know of students who've gone to or whatever. People from your town have gone there. The reality is there's a huge range of schools. So it's right around 70 boarding schools throughout the US and Canada that offer highly competitive hockey programs. Within that, there's going to be a huge range in size, curriculum, how strong their hockey programs are looking for, and ultimately the success that a student's going to find at those places is going to be determined on an individualized basis, right? Not every school is going to be the right school for every kid. And so when we're working with a family, the things we're often talking about at the beginning stage of the process, where most of you are now in terms of timing, is one, first of all, helping them to understand this wide range which exists, which oftentimes they're surprised by. And then really talking through, based on the profile of this student academically, where will they be? Could they be successful? Where potentially do they have the highest likelihood of being admitted? From a social standpoint, is the school we're looking at one where the student is going to feel well connected, right? Are they looking at big schools or small schools? For some students, an all boys school or an all girls school might be right. For some schools, for some students, a highly pressurized academic environment is one they're going to thrive in. For other students, an environment where there's more academic support might be better. And then from a hockey standpoint, right? Like, are you looking for an opportunity to jump in and play at the varsity level right away? Great. Based on that, where in sort of the echelon of these programs might those opportunities exist for you? And what is the right fit? We are big believers in the idea that the number one thing that is going to determine whether or not this is going to be a successful experience for your son or daughter when they go to prep school. The thing that will determine its success is your child's happiness, right? And ultimately, their happiness is dependent on us making sure that it's the right fit for them academically, socially, and athletically. If all three of those things are not right, if any one of those is the wrong fit, the likelihood of that student finding success there can be really challenging. And so for us, as we talk to families, it's really thinking through those three parts equally to try and find the right opportunities for students. And for a lot of families, they're oftentimes at the beginning of the process surprised by how many options there might be that they were unaware of. And we can also talk a little bit later about how widening your net, is going to make you a more attractive candidate in certain applicant pools. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about how kind of the admission process at these schools works. So the process of applying to boarding schools or prep schools, for some of you, you guys live in an area where there's also some day schools you might be applying to. The process of applying to the schools is pretty consistent. There's multiple steps to it that require a high level of organization. So what I mean by that is essentially to apply to all of these schools, the process you're going to follow is you're going to have to, all of the students are going to have to complete an admissions interview as part of that process. That's normally done by going to a school, scheduling a visit, getting a tour, completing the admissions interview in person. If that's not possible, you're also able to arrange Zoom interviews at schools. Following that, the components that you will need to apply to schools are all of the same. All of the students are going to need to complete a written application. They're going to need to submit a transcript, a current transcript from their school. They're going to need to submit recommendations from their current math and current English teacher. There's a parent statement that needs to be completed. And some schools will require standardized testing, and that can vary widely from school to school. Some schools require standardized testing, some schools don't. The beginning parts of that process I just discussed will be largely consistent at every school. It won't vary very much. So One of the other ways this is really different from the or the college process, I should say, is like generally what you hear a lot about in colleges is like, well, it can't hurt to apply. So it can't hurt to apply to more schools. So, there's no difference whether we apply to 6 schools, 8 schools, or 10 schools. To be totally transparent, and I always talk about this process and try to give families insight into how schools think about it, not families. From a school standpoint, if I'm evaluating the application of a student, seeing a student applying to 10 schools or 12 schools, um, yeah, that actually can impact or in some ways cause some pause in the admission decision that a school might make. So from a school standpoint, the two things that they are most worried about is their acceptance rate and what they call their yield, right? So all of the schools want as many students as possible to apply. And then ultimately, of the group of students that they choose to admit, that's their acceptance rate, which they want that to be low. Of their admitted students, they want as many of those students to say yes as possible. In many instances, what boarding schools will think about is like, well, if I see the student and he or she is applying to 10 or 12 schools, and I'm not sure that realistically we will have a chance that this student will say yes if we admit them, that would negatively impact our yield as a school. And so I might be less likely to admit them. How do you prevent that is ultimately, as we talked about before, being an advocate and having somebody advocating for the students we work with. We're continually advocating with schools to help them understand, like, ultimately, if he or she is admitted, you do have a reasonably high likelihood of getting them. But it is a different process than college in that more is not always better. Um, and then the last thing I talk about is, and this is also hard for families, having some understanding of what a school's applicant pool looks like can significantly impact what opportunities or where your son or daughter might be accepted. So if I were going to make this, which I will, as specific to this group as possible, right? Talking to families from Fairfield County, Westchester County, the tri-state area in New York, I could probably rattle off a group of schools that you all know of, right? Like I could say Taft and Westminster and Berkshire School or Salisbury and Avon. Um, and all of those are great schools. From a school standpoint, the reality of their situation is the largest number of applicants they have come from your area. So for students from your area, it's actually more competitive at those places than, say, some of the schools in Eastern Massachusetts, which are equally competitive, whether that's St. Mark's or St. George's or Brooks School or even St. Paul's or Andover or Exeter, because less of their applicant pool is going to be drawn from the Westchester County or New York area. In some cases, a student might have more of an opportunity there just because of geographic diversity, and vice versa. Like when I'm working with a family from the Boston area, I sometimes talk to them about, like, hey, it's going to be really hard for you to get into St. Mark's, or it might be harder for you to get into St. Mark's or St. Paul's or Brooks because so many of their applicants are from your geographic area where, Berkshire and Taft and Westminster have less applicants from there. So really understanding that is what we really do in trying to shape the list of schools where we're talking to students about where they would apply. And then ultimately, once we determine that and where a student's going to be admissible, we start thinking about the athletic fit. Um, Great. So where you should begin. I always talk to families when we're working with families, we kind of go through a similar exercise to this. But if you're going to begin this process on your own, what I would advise doing is you want to kind of create a preliminary criteria of things that are going to be important to you, which are going to help you shape and target which schools you might want to look at first. So when we're working with a family, these are some of the things we're talking to them about, right? Distance, right? How far from home do you want to be? Like, is if you want to be in an hour and a half or 2 hours from home, you guys from Mid Fairfield are really lucky in that there's a large number of schools that are going to fit into that range. Now, as I talked about, it might be more challenging because of the depth of those applicant pools. So, are you willing to look a little bit wider? Are you willing to stretch that to 3 hours and include some of those Metro Boston area schools in this? Um, Size of school. This is something people often don't think about, but there's a huge range of schools in terms of size. There are schools that have, some really competitive hockey programs that are less than 200 students. And there are some schools that have really competitive hockey programs that have more than 1,000 students. And those schools, in terms of their academic fit, what it feels like culturally, the type of support that a student is going to have there, are going to be vastly different. So, thinking about where you think your son or daughter, or as a student, where you think might be the best fit, is going to help you kind of narrow that list down a little bit. Academic culture. When we talk about academic culture, there are some schools where they're pressurized academic environments, and I say that in the best way, right? Like there are some students who are going to thrive in academic environments that are highly competitive, that you know provide students an opportunity to compete academically just like they would on a rink. For some students, that's going to be the best environment. For other students, a more supportive environment where there's academic support when needed or things like that might be a better fit. And so, really talking about where the academic fit is and what feels like might be best is one of the things you want to talk about. Um, yeah, specific academic programs, as you start going through these schools and looking at them, you will be blown away by the academic programming that some of these schools offer. You know, Millbrook School has a zoo, a fully functioning zoo on their campus. Like, you could go there and literally work in a zoo. Berkshire School, where Damian and I's children are, they have an aviation science program. You can graduate from there and get your pilot's license. Tabor Academy in Marion, Mass. They have a fully functioning sailing ship where you can go and take classes for 6 weeks on a sailboat and do that. So, are there some academic programs that might be interesting to you, and will that shape your list? Single sex options. I really do encourage early in this process all of my families to at least think about one single sex option, right? In my experience, for some students, they're going to go visit a single sex school and know right away that either, hey, this is an option, an opportunity for me that might be a good one, or ultimately, no, it's not going to be, but thinking about that. These next two are really interesting ones that I kind of grouped together. What are your athletic goals and what's your timeline for achieving those goals, right? So if your goal is, you know, I just want to play varsity hockey, okay, great. That can mean a lot of different things. Is your goal that I want to play varsity hockey in my first year there and I'm applying as a ninth or 10th grader? Okay, great. There are going to be places where that opportunity might exist for you, and there's going to be places where that opportunity might not exist for you. Um, if your timeline is, I want to find the right school and I'm willing to play a lesser role or play in a different team in their program for a year or two and then move up, great. So understanding what your timeline is to achieve those goals can be really important because at some schools, um, you know, you might be able to, if you're applying as a ninth grader. I think a huge misconception out there is that the only kids who can play varsity prep hockey are repeat 11th graders. Those days are done. River School last year was one of the best boys prep teams in New England. They had 5 or 6 freshmen. St. Mark's had 5 or 6 freshmen playing regular shifts. I had 4 boys that I worked with last year who went to prep school as true ninth graders and were on varsity hockey teams. So, depending on what your goals are and what your timeline is, that ultimately may shape the list of schools you're looking at. Um, are you willing to reconsider reclassifying? Yeah, we could do a whole presentation about the pros and cons of reclassification. What I mean by that is like if you're a current ninth grader or current 10th grader, are you open to applying to school as a 10th grader, or do you only want to go in as an 11th grader? So, we try to avoid using the term repeating because it's not accurate. Like academically, students aren't going in and repeating coursework, but they are in the same grade. Um, so reclassification, there's all sorts of pros and cons to it, and I think ultimately now with the changes in college hockey and the opportunities, right, what is going to be the right path for students from a hockey standpoint to reclassify? I think that is a really open debate. I will say from an admission standpoint, um, it is something that's worth thinking about. Like, again, if we go back to the beginning of this presentation and we talked about, is this the right time? Sometimes I hear families say, like, okay, well, we're going to wait until, you know, he's going to apply as an 11th grader. Um, Ultimately, at some of these schools, their largest entry point is going to be in ninth grade, right? Like, some schools are going to admit 120 ninth grade students, boys and girls, in the hopes of having a ninth grade class of 90. In their 10th grade class, they might admit 45 new 10th graders in the hopes of enrolling 30 new 10th grade students, boys and girls. For the 11th grade, they might admit 10, 15 students in the hopes of adding, you know, 8 to 10 new 11th graders. And I don't mean hockey players. I mean that broadly. Like I had a conversation with a school last year about one of my students who was a true 10th grader applying as an 11th grader. And the school came back to me and said, like, look, he's a great applicant. We would love to admit him. From a hockey standpoint, we've got an opportunity for him here. Our problem is, like, for our 11th grade class, we are trying to enroll 5 new 11th grade boys total, not hockey players, like total boys, and trying to add 5 girls. So if he wants to be here, the opportunity for him is going to be to reclassify as a 10th grader. So oftentimes what's lost in that conversation around reclassifying is from an admission standpoint, there could be some real advantages to reclassifying just in terms of what that means about getting admitted. Um, and then, yeah, lastly, are there other co-curricular programs or sports besides, hockey that you might want to participate in, right? Are you a soccer player? Are you a lacrosse player? Are you a musician? Is there theater? And that might shape some of how you might want to begin to formulate a preliminary list. Um, as you're going through it, right? So I think about that last list as the things that are important to you as a family. As we think about it from a school standpoint, we talk to our families a lot about, important sort of facts or factors to look at as you're examining schools. So total enrollment, right? That goes back to this large or small sort of size, right? Like what is the number of students you're looking for? Campus setting. There are some schools that are in close proximity to a town. There are some schools that are actually set in a town. There are other schools where, hey, it's going to be 25 or 30 minutes to the next town. So is that a factor for you? Does that matter? Um, these next two are ones that oftentimes families don't think about that we talk to families a lot about. So if you're going to go to a boarding school as a boarding student, understanding what other percentage of the students at that school board, and then also what percentage of the students are domestic. So for my families or our families, when we're talking to them about a student that we have who's going to go and be a boarding student, some of the numbers or targets we're usually trying to talk about is like trying to find schools where the percentage of boarding students is, 70% or more. And that's really important because look, if you're going to be away from home, you don't want to be at a school where at night or on the weekend it's just going to empty out, right? Like you want it to be a lively community if you're going to be a boarding student. And number of domestic students, I think one of the great things about boarding school is the diversity that they can provide and the opportunity to live with and learn from kids from all over the country and all over the world. Um, one of the things that we try to avoid sometimes is there are some schools where the percentage of boarding students might be 50%, and then the percentage of international students might be 40 or 45%. So if we have a student from Connecticut or New York or Massachusetts who's going to that school, he may be only 5% of the population that is going to be a domestic boarding student, right? So those are some things we think about in shaping the list. Male to student ratio, for some people, that's a factor. 5 or 6 day academic schedule is one that I talk to my families a lot about, right? There are some schools that have 6 academic days of class each week, half day Wednesday and a half day Saturday. There are some that only have 5. For some kids, that's going to be a huge factor in their decision. So knowing which, if that is important to you, knowing which schools are which can be really important. If you're an older student and you're applying as a postgraduate, obviously making sure the school accepts postgraduates can be important. If you're not a postgraduate, and you are an athlete, understanding whether or not the school accepts postgraduates can also be a really important factor. So, for our families, a lot of times in that scenario of finding the right athletic fit, like if we have a student that's going to go into a school as a, say, ninth or 10th grader, and maybe is going to play on a school's third line as their 10th grader, but 5 of the guys ahead of him in that lineup are graduating the next year. The idea there would be that there's going to be opportunities for him to move up. Now, if it's a school that accepts postgraduates and historically has a history of taking in a lot of postgraduates, there could be a situation where if all of a sudden that school enrolls 6 or 7 postgraduates who are hockey players, the opportunity for that student who went in as a 10th grader might be more limited than it looked. So understanding if the school accepts postgraduates and how that might impact your athletic opportunity is an important one. And that's, again, there are some schools like the ISL schools out east, like they don't allow postgraduates. And I have lots of families who simply because of that, it makes it, a more attractive option. Yeah, how many teams does your school offer in their primary sport, right? Like, so if you're not someone who's going to go in on the varsity level, what might be your path going forward and how likely it is? Obviously, if you're someone who is targeting and going in at the varsity level, like you're really going to want to understand what your role in that team might be. Yeah, and then understanding what the acceptances and matriculation for students in that sport are, right? All of these schools have really impressive college outcomes, but really understanding like are students in what are the opportunities for the students in playing hockey coming out of here, right? And those are all really things that you want to start to think about as you're trying to target what schools you might ultimately want to visit. Um, some places you can find some of this information. So I'll tell you like some of the statistics I talked about and things like that. Niche.com is a really good site. Um, I forewarn everyone about Niche in the sense of the information about the schools on Niche is all really good. The statistics are all accurate. The information about their programming is really accurate. And part of that is because the schools are providing it. Niche does have a ranking system. I will tell you, as someone who worked in boarding schools, there are, I won't go into details, but there are lots of reasons why those rankings do not accurately reflect the academic culture at a school or what the acceptance rate may be or things like that. So I always tell my families like Niche is a great place to get information about the school. The ranking part of it, I wouldn't pay that much attention to. Boarding School Review has similar information to Niche. Boarding School Review will provide you with some acceptance rates for schools. Niche does not provide acceptance rates. USHR.com is a great website from a hockey standpoint. That's where they are the ones who actually determine the NEPSAC rankings for the playoffs. So if you are a hockey player, USHR.com is a great place to see updated rosters and stats. Neutral Zone is also another one I know that does a really, really good job. Um, okay, so next steps in the process. For our families, when we go through this process, Damien and I will meet with families multiple times to go through and create what we will call a preliminary list of schools based on criteria and our understanding of what a family is looking for, but also what the student's goals are, and ultimately where, based on our knowledge and knowledge of the student, like he or she is going to have a reasonably high likelihood of being admissible. What we normally do is create a preliminary list that we will then talk our families through, and we'll try and narrow it down to roughly 8 to 10 schools that we feel like, one, the student has a reasonably high likelihood of being admitted to, two, meets the criteria for distance, for size, for academic culture, for the programming they're looking for, all of those things, and three, based on our knowledge of the school's hockey program and maybe our conversations with the coaches, at least at the beginning of the process, there might be, there's a reasonable expectation that his goals in that program might be attainable. So for us, at that point, we're having our families complete inquiry forms to about 8 to 10 schools. I always tell families like the really important part about this process is always thinking about it step by step and not jumping ahead. So for our families, like we talk about, we're going to create this criteria to figure out which schools are the ones that we want to complete the inquiry forms at. Great. We're going to complete the inquiry forms at 8 to 10 schools. We're then going to get that information back and we're going to talk more. And for us, after our families complete the inquiry forms, that's when we start doing our outreach to directors of admission and coaches about our clients. And after that, we're going to have another conversation where the next step would be narrowing that down to, 6 to 8 schools that we might go and visit. So for us, it's creating criteria to determine which schools we want to inquire at, having more engaged conversations with those schools and the families to then determine which school it is that we're going to visit, right? So we think about it in steps. Once we determine which schools our students are going to visit, the next step for us is then planning visits, helping our families plan visits. So at all of the schools you'll go to, students are going to be required to do an admissions interview. We really prefer that our students, if they're able, go to campus, get a tour, and do an admissions interview in person. For our students, prior to them going, we're doing outreach to the directors of admission at the school and saying, like, this is the profile of the student, this is what they're looking for, this is why we've put the school on the list, and based on what we know of them academically, this is why we think they'll be a good candidate. And then also doing outreach to coaches and saying, hey, we've got this young man who's coming to visit on November 11th. Here's who he's playing for. Here are his goals and aspirations, and this is why he's coming to see a school. So if you're doing it on your own, you can schedule those appointments, and you can ask to try to meet with a coach when you go for your admissions interviews. For our families, we're trying to get the bulk of our interviews done before mid-December so that from December through the application deadline, we can really focus on on the application materials and the athletic fit. But you have the flexibility to visit schools all the way through the end of January and early February. And again, as we think about it step by step, when our families go and visit, we're not trying to determine what school they're going to go to. We're using the visits to determine what um, what schools they may ultimately want to apply to. Um, yeah, contacting coaches. So if you schedule a visit at a school, the admission office will ask you like, hey, what sport do you want to play? Would you like to meet with a coach when you're here? And I will say, oftentimes coaches do their best to try to meet as many students as they can. I also got like for us again, we are fortunate in that working with our families and our relationships with these schools, we're able to largely ensure that when all of our families are going to visit, they will have opportunities to meet with coaches. That may not happen when you go and visit again. if you have a 9:30 appointment at a school and that coach has 4 math classes in a row that he's teaching that morning, he's not going to have an opportunity to meet with you. That doesn't necessarily mean he's not interested, right? If he hears from the admission office that, hey, this kid came, he seemed like a really great kid. It looks like he's playing for a really high level team. From what we've heard of, he might be a strong candidate. Oftentimes, coaches will then follow up and go out to figure out where, to try and learn more about you and understanding whether or not you could be a fit or play a role in their hockey program. Um, in your initial outreach, if you want to send coaches videos, that's great. I will tell you that generally they're not going to watch videos until later in the process. And part of that is, again, for them, the way it works for a lot of these coaches is, oops, sorry. Um, Typical experience for a prep school coach might be this, right? Like, hey, from September until the end of January, 180 or 200 boys hockey players came and visited my school. I might have emailed with some of them or met with some handful of them while they were here. And maybe within that group that came and visited, there were 5 or 6 kids that I saw play over the summer or spring, and they came and visited. That's great. In January, the admission office is going to come to me and say, hey, of the 200 boys hockey players who visited, these 180 applied. In the second week of February or so, the admission office is going to come to me and say, like, of the 180 boys hockey players who applied, these 25 or 30 have a high likelihood of being admissible. So within that group, now there's some number of that group and within will play from recreational hockey to AAA hockey. So at that point, coaches are then going to go back through and say, like, hey, this young man, it sounds like he's going to be admissible. Looks like he's playing for a really good team. I've watched his video, or now, because I know he's admissible, now I'm going to go out and watch him play because ultimately the admission office is going to come back to me and say, okay, within this group of hockey players, who are the ones that you would most likely want us to admit? And at that point, coaches are going to, start to impact the admission decision. So I say all of that because if you're reaching out to a coach in October or November and sending them a video prior to your visit with the expectation that, like, hey, when I get there, that coach is going to tell me exactly where I'm going to fit into their program. In all likelihood, that's not going to happen in your initial visit or contact with them. The other thing that's really different about prep school process from the college process for coaches is, look, it's at the college level, if a coach is looking for 4 forwards, he's going to go out and see 4 forwards. And if he likes them, he's going to offer them a spot on his team. The admission office is in all likelihood going to admit that student. That student might sign a letter of intent. So if I'm looking for 4 forward spots, coaches are going to go out and recruit 4 kids. Prep school is really different. In prep school, if I'm trying to bring 4 forwards into my school, part of what I'm trying to figure out with my admission office is how many forwards do I actually have to push to get admitted? Because it's not 4, right? Because all of these kids might be looking at multiple schools. So if we admit 6 students and only 3 of them say yes, well, now we're 1 forward short, right? But if we only admit 4, and all 4 of them get admitted to 3 or 4 other schools and each only one of them chooses to come here, now we haven't met our goal. So that goes back to that idea of yield. So ultimately for coaches, they really try in February to try to get a sense of where students might fit into their program so they can communicate that to families with the hopes of getting a better sense of yield. I will say, sort of our one of the plugs I will throw in for the work Damian and I do, and I think a large reason why we've been able to have a lot of success in creating opportunities for our kids is schools do really appreciate that we're able to provide them a really good sense of, like, hey, if you admit this student, this is the likelihood of you getting him and yielding them so that they're able to more, we can be really helpful in schools managing their acceptance rate and their yield, and we can use that knowledge to help increase the amount of opportunities that we're able to create for our students. Um, so an ideal timeline, if you guys are thinking about doing this, this is sort of roughly what it would look like. For a lot of our families now, we're kind of, you know, starting step one or just past step one and are at a point where we're scheduling visits. The most challenging thing for all of you and Damian and I know this from working with our families is that like with the school and hockey schedules, finding times to visit schools can be really challenging. And so, for us, that oftentimes is the hardest piece. So yeah, your goal is to be trying to schedule those visits between now and mid-January. Your next step is going to be to follow up with coaches. In the midst of that, you're going to work on your application materials. All of these schools have application deadlines that are going to be sometime between January 15th and January 30th. So you're going to want to get the materials in then. All of the boarding schools provide their admission decisions on March 10th. Um, Again, one of the advantages that we always tell our families, because of our ability to communicate with schools, and the advantage that provides not only to our families but our schools, for our families, we have no surprises. Like we are going to be aware of what the admission decisions are going to be at the vast majority of the schools before March 10th, which allows us to have real conversations with coaches to understand that, hey, on March 10th, he is going to get admitted. And if he comes here, here's the role in the hockey program. If you're doing it on your own, you're going to get all of your admission decisions on March 10th. Between March 10th and April 10th, all of the schools that you've been accepted to have revisit days where you get to go back to the school. Ideally, for our families, like we're trying to limit that to them revisiting two, maybe three schools, and then you would finalize your enrollment decision in April. Here's our last slide, and then I'll answer some questions, right? So what Damien and I do in kind of working with students is, help you to manage all of these things that we just talked about. So one of the things that's really different about how we work, like we work with a small group of families. We don't do hourly, right? So all of our families have as much time and access to us as they need. So for us, having multiple meetings to create that preliminary list and doing some of those things, yeah, can take some time. We continue to cull that list down to figure out where the best fits are and where students are going to be admissible. We're helping to plan, our visits and advocating for admissions directors for all of our students before they're going on visits. We're helping them. We're doing interview prep with all of our students. But also, yeah, bulk of our time is then spent talking to directors of admission and coaches before students are going on their visits so that these schools are well aware, not just the hockey coaches, but the admission office, like why this student is here and why, based on our knowledge of that school's applicant pool, why we believe there will be really strong candidates. And then to the coaches, based on our expertise and knowledge of the student as a player, why we think this student might be able to play a role for them in their program. Um, for us, we're then also helping with application materials and continuing to narrow it down. Um, as I said, our families are not going to be surprised by admission decisions. We're going to know what they are. So oftentimes for our families, what we're talking about is like, okay, you're going to be admitted to these three schools. And at school number one, they feel like you would be a top six forward right away if you go there. At school number two, you're going to be admitted, but might be more towards the bottom of their lineup. At school three, you're going to be somewhere in the middle. So understanding that we have already determined prior to us knowing you're going to be accepted that these schools are the right fits for you academically and socially. Now we need to determine based on the athletic opportunities which is the ones that you want. And then we continue to help our families through them making the enrollment decision and ultimately, continue to provide support with our families once they're in school. I had 4 conversations today with families of students who are already in schools. And so, we really do help to engage. One. I said I was going to do it in an hour. That was pretty good.
You need a
So I
glass of
know
water.
yeah, we threw a lot at you. I see. Yeah, in the chat, somebody has asked for recording. Yes, this is recorded, and we are going to send this recording as well as the slide deck out to all of you in the organization. And as I said, we will also, in that you have our contact information. Our website is www.darcoassociates.com. If you go on there, not only will you get our contact information, but we have a string of webinars, including a series we've started of doing interviews and conversations with prep school coaches. So as of tomorrow, I think the 11th, one of those will go up there. So it's a great resource to hear from some of the coaches themselves about how the admission process works. Questions? All right. Damian, is there anything I missed?
I can't imagine there's anything you missed. I will just say again, having gone through it, to really do your research as much as we will help you. It's important that you do your own research, and that that your player is as invested in this process as the parents are. If it's being pushed by the parents, I'll add that as a fourth tenet to Brad's three others, that if it's being pushed by the parent more than the player, then it also may not work out as well as you might think. So just be really sure that your player is definitely interested, is invested in the process as far as filling things out and writing essays and emailing coaches, him or herself, because I think that's a very important step to this. At the end of the day, if they're at a place because you want them to be and not because they want to be, again, that doesn't usually work out for the best. So just make sure it's a at least a 70-30 proposition from the player or the student, him or herself, as it is with the parents.
And the last thing I'll add is this hypothetical, because I think for all of you on here, as I said, like you're here because you have some interest in prep schools, and I would imagine some of you are wrestling with that first question that we started with, is now the right time? So I always tell families, like, look, if I could guarantee you today that like your son or daughter, we could find a school that was going to be the perfect fit for them academically, that we knew socially they were going to be really happy there and create a group of friends who were going to be lifelong friends. And from a hockey standpoint, it was going to be the exact opportunity they were looking for. Would you be interested in that? The answer to that question is almost always yes. Now, you do not know that that doesn't exist until you go through the process. And ultimately, as I said, if you go through the process and you find those opportunities, you may still decide that the right thing to do is to stay home another year or pursue another option or opportunity. But ultimately, all you are doing by not going through the admissions process is limiting options. And if we can be any help in supporting you through that process, or even happy to answer questions of like, hey, we want to dip our toe in the water and kind of do it on our own, great, we're happy to help direct you. But my last piece would be that if you're here and a part of this meeting, it's because you're thinking about it. And if you are, there is nothing lost. You lose nothing by going through the admissions process and seeing what opportunities might exist for your child. So um, I thank you all for participating. We will get you all of this information. I hope it was super helpful. And as I said, I encourage you all to check out our website, and review some of the other webinars that are there. So thank you all very much.